Hungering, thirsting, and filled. Those are our three words for tonight. Obviously, the words come from this particular verse. We do need to have a good understanding of what it means to hunger and thirst. Notice first off that Jesus does not say, blessed are those who hunger and blessed are those who thirst. He says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst. The hungering and the thirsting are just as imperative and just as equal as one another. It's not saying that you might have no hunger, but you would have thirst, or you might not have any thirst, but you will have hunger. Jesus is talking about on both aspects of that spectrum, hungering and thirsting. You have absolutely nothing with which to sustain yourself anymore. Food and water are gone, except for one place. And that's the place that you have to go to receive this type of food and this type of water in order for you to be filled. And when we're talking about filled, remember it's sort of like Psalm 23, that my cup runneth over. And if you remember when we studied through some of the different Psalms, and especially when we talked about some of the names of God, and we're going to mention a few of those tonight. If you remember when we studied from Psalm 23, Jehovah Rohi, the Lord is my shepherd, or the Lord my shepherd is. And he's the one that fills my cup to overflowing. And if you remember from that particular psalm, what that was is that if a person was a guest in another person's home, every time that cup began to have a lesser amount in it, the host would keep filling it up. But when he stopped filling it up, that's when he wanted you to understand, okay, it's time to go home. But the Lord never stops filling your cup. He never wants you to leave. He wants you to always be there. So my cup overflows. That's the filling that this verse is actually talking about. So let's get into some of these things. Acts chapter 7, verses 26 through 28 that was read for us just a moment ago. Notice that Paul talked about all the nations of the world are actually combined under one bloodline. That there's not to be, even as we talked about this morning, all the division that exists between different people from different times, different places, different races, different sects, different places in society. God made us all from one bloodline. But he did that so that we might all understand that though we can look at one another and we see division from time to time, God does not. And what God wants us to see is that we are to unite together, that we might grope for him. Because the division that we will sometimes see amongst ourselves causes us to grope and to reach out and try to grab at different things. It may be unique to me being a man, or it may be unique to me being white, or it may be unique to me being American, or unique to this time period that I'm living in. But if I define myself by that, I'm going to reach out and try to gain control of different things based upon whatever is very, very subjective to me. But God's objective standard is this: God is not far from each and every one of us. And that what God wants is us to be groping for him, to be looking for, leaning toward, reaching out, trying to find God in every aspect of our life. And that's how Paul tried to unite these people in Athens when he was talking about these certain things. Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes had these first three Beatitudes that said, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn. And as we looked at a couple of weeks ago, blessed are the meek. And all three of these first three Beatitudes were about the emptying process. Poor in spirit. You're completely spiritually bankrupt. You have nothing anymore. You have wasted it all, and you've brought yourself to this condition. Then it says in the very next one, blessed are those who mourn. It rightfully causes us to be heartbroken, to be distraught, to understand that since we have lost everything, it was because of we ourselves that we have done that. And that God is the only one who can wipe away that tear. But it's still about that letting go and that admitting of who's actually at fault. Blessed are those who are meek. Blessed are those who humble themselves as a result of that, knowing that it's only from God that they can be comforted, and that's the only source of comfort. When you see that all three of these first Beatitudes are about emptying yourself, it makes sense that the next one would be, blessed are those who are in that situation, that they are so destitute, they are so without, they are so empty that they are longing and desiring to be filled. And we know that people are going to fill their lives with something. Later in the book of Matthew, Matthew chapter 12, verses 43 through 45, if you turn over a few chapters of that, Matthew 12, 43 through 45, Jesus is talking about an unclean spirit, and he says that when an unclean spirit goes out of a man, he goes through dry places seeking rest, and he finds none. Then he says, I will return to my house from which I came. And when he comes, he finds it empty, swept, and put in order. Then he goes and takes with him 7 other spirits more wicked than himself, and they enter and dwell there, and the last state of that man is worse than the first. So it shall be with this wicked generation. So Jesus is talking about this idea of being in want, being in need. And here it's because this person, this evil spirit has left him. And it's much like what we will sometimes do, in that we will empty ourselves of a lot of the things that have been sinful and have been wrong, but we haven't replaced them with anything that's good. And so what happens is the evil that we let out of our life, if we don't replace that with something that's good, that evil is going to come back. And it's going to come back with a vengeance. And it's going to come back a lot worse than it was at the very, very beginning. So Jesus in the Beatitudes is saying, it's a good thing for you to be empty. However, that should cause a longing and a desire within you for those things that are righteous. If you've truly spiritually bankrupted yourself, if you're truly mourning over your sins, if you've truly humbled yourself in the presence of God, that will do nothing but cultivate an insatiable appetite for the things of God. And you won't be satisfied with anything else. That's what Jesus is using to describe this hunger and this thirst. Thayer says that both of these words, both hunger and thirst, have the same definition except for the object of them. Equivalent to suffering want, to be needy, metaphorically to crave ardently, to seek with eager desire. So in other words, both hunger and thirst are the exact same definition, but hunger is a desire for food, thirst is a desire for water. Jesus says that both of these words are pointing toward the idea of hungering and thirsting after righteousness. That's what you want. That's what you need. And that's the only thing that you can be satisfied by. And so these are both absolute terms that emphasize the painfulness and the longing that's associated with that, until it is refreshed, until it is supported, until it is able to gain something that's sustaining. If you've ever been really, really hungry, and I would ask you to think about it, when's the last time you've really been hungry? Not that you wanted something to eat or you felt a little bit of hunger. I mean, hungry. If you did not have something to eat, you felt like you were going to die. Or that thirsty, that you felt like you were about to die. I don't know that I've ever been in that situation before. Some people have. And those who feel that type of hunger, that type of thirst, they're not going to be denied access to whatever it is that will satisfy that hunger or that thirst. And they will do anything to get it. That's how it's supposed to be when it comes to the idea of righteousness. When you're hungry, you do have pain in your life. When you're thirsty, you do have pain in your life. And it causes headaches. It causes disorientation. Why is the world walking around disoriented and in pain? Because there is a hunger that's there. And it's not being satisfied. And it's being satisfied with the wrong types of things. You can be out in the middle of the ocean, dying of thirst, and there's water all around you. But if you drink the water from that ocean, it's going to kill you that much faster. And that's a good description of how this world is right now. That there's people who are dying of thirst, and they're drinking from the ocean water, and not realizing what it will do to them. And so these are the kinds of people that have nothing left that's required to sustain the basics of their life. They don't just hunger, but they also thirst. And so as I said a moment ago, these are the kinds of people that are going to pay anything in order to get it. These are like the ones that are described in Matthew chapter 13, verses 45 and 46. The ones who realize that there's a pearl of great price that is out there. And Jesus says it this way in verses 45 and 46. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant who is seeking beautiful pearls, who, when he has found one pearl of great price, went and sold all that he had in order to buy it. This type of food and water is something that that person is willing to pay whatever the cost is in order to get it. They'll give up family, they'll give up friends, they'll give up lands, they'll give up all those things that Jesus told Peter that there's no one who has given up those things, forsaken those things for the kingdom's sake, who will not receive even more so in this life and in the end, eternal life. But he uses it to say, look, that's what you're going to have to be willing to do. If you're that hungry, if you're that thirsty, if you're not willing to give up everything in order to pay it, it means that you're not hungry and you're not thirsty. You feel like something else has satisfied you, and you feel perfectly content where you are. It is something that we can even cultivate within our children. Ephesians 6 and verse 4, fathers are told to not provoke their children to wrath, but we're to bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. And I've told you this many times before, with that word that's used there for nurture, it means that you're developing an appetite within them. You're bringing them up with something that they're going to love and desire that taste the rest of their life. You're nurturing them. You're giving them what is necessary for their sustainment, but you're developing an appetite so that when they become teenagers, when they become young adults, they don't forsake this way, but they always learn to lean upon it. It is also something that is absolute and it's all-consuming. Matthew 22:37, love the Lord your God, and you know the rest of it, with everything you have, all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, everything that you have, that is totally devoted to God. When we hunger and thirst, when we love the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, those two ideas are synonymous with one another. The only thing that I can think about, the only thing I'm consumed with, the only thing that I am willing to pay everything in order to obtain it is to have that type of relationship with my God. That's hungering and thirsting after righteousness. But when you think about what is not hungering and thirsting after righteousness, when you look through the world around us, even things like the necessities of life, some people put those things ahead of hungering and thirsting after righteousness. Jesus said, don't worry about food. Don't worry about shelter. Don't worry about those things. Those are the kinds of things that the world seeks after, but not us. And so that can't be number one. Sometimes we're always looking for something in the world to be made right, some type of societal justice. You're not going to get it. And even if you did, you would not be satisfied with it. And the reason being is because this is a voracious appetite of its own. And it's something that no one is ever satisfied with. We will never be able to do enough to satisfy people of this world. Ever. No matter what level of justice we give. It doesn't matter. Because God does not say that this is where our heart is supposed to be. We can look after things like power or revenge or things like money that give us power and the ability to take revenge. You will never be satisfied with any of those things. God never tells us to let that be your pursuit. Let that be the thing that you're looking after. Let this be the thing that you find fulfillment in. Even when it comes to knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. But it doesn't mean that knowledge or any of these other things are bad necessarily in and of themselves. But it does mean that you'll never be satisfied with it. You think about other things such as happiness or feelings, those things that make me feel happy or are going to give me the feeling of fulfillment in whatever area it may be. You'll never be satisfied with it because there's always something else. There's always that next new thing or that next strange thing or that next odd thing or that next unique thing. There's always something that comes along that people define their lives with. Excessiveness or escape. This is where addiction comes from. Sometimes people just want to forget about problems, forget about things of the world, and so they will give themselves over to excess in a lot of different areas. All of these things that you see in that list, the book of Ecclesiastes makes very, very plain that these things never give fulfillment. Read Ecclesiastes, and you can find everything on that left side. And you remember what the wise man said about all of those things? Vanity, grasping for the wind. You'll never find fulfillment in it. That's why Jesus never says, blessed is the man who pursues any of these things. He never says, blessed is the man that pursues this. Ever. So, unblessed hunger, unblessed thirst are those types of things. Hungering and thirsting after righteousness is the only thing that God says He will give fulfillment to. That's why it's so important. And that's why God gives us a singular goal in life instead of all these other things. If these things come, they can be blessings in and of themselves in a lot of ways. But we have to let God be God and be content with what He gives and the way in which He provides it. We also need to understand this. There is no hunger or thirst among the dead. You can go to the graveyard, and there's a lot of people in that graveyard, and not one of them is hungry and not one of them is thirsty. There's no hungering and thirsting among the dead. If I still do not have this appetite, this hunger, this thirst after righteousness, then I need to be asking myself, so what condition am I in really? Am I really growing? Am I trying to mature? Am I trying to move to what God would have me to be? And that's why when I go through the Beatitudes, it is so very, very convicting, because Jesus is so, it's inspirational when we look back at it and we think, wow, look at what Jesus said we are to be and what we can be. But it's really challenging and convicting when I look at myself in the mirror and say, is that me? Because there's too many things on that left-hand side that I think I'm going to find fulfillment in. And I forget what the wise man said. Fear God and keep his commandments. That's the all of man. That's the total duty of man. That's the reason that you were created. Romans 3 verse 23, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. What that means is we have all fallen short of fearing God and keeping his commandments. The New Testament, Hebrews 11 verse 6 tells us that without faith it's impossible to please him. Those who come to God must believe he is. He's a reward of those who diligently seek him. That's the same thing as fear God and keep his commandments. The reason we've all fallen short of the glory of God is short of believing he is, and that he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. And so we go about saying that one of these things is going to be my God, or the pursuit of one of these things is going to give me a fulfilling life and give me purpose and meaning in my life. It's going to mean I'm going to leave a legacy or whatever else it is. I'm going to make a name for myself. I'm going to be famous or whatever. If I hunger and thirst after righteousness, that's when I will be filled. That's the thing that can give satisfaction. And so Jesus does give us that idea. The picture is of one who lives and breathes, and every fiber of his being is about pleasing God. Jesus says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. And if you remember, that word righteousness means conformity to God's standard. Even in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus had to point out that this does not mean conformity to your standard or my standard or someone else's standard. Matthew 5 and verse 20, just a few verses after the Beatitudes, Jesus talked about the scribes and the Pharisees. And he says, for I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. This is about the most deepest part of who we are. And that the religious elite of the time, Jesus would point to them and say, right after he said, blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, right after that, he points to the scribes and Pharisees and says, unless your righteousness exceeds theirs. And I think for a lot of people, it was easy for them to understand what Jesus was talking about, because outwardly they did appear to be very, very righteous people. They were laying heavy burdens upon the people. From Matthew 23, we see that. But they were not lifting them or willing to lend one finger to lift them themselves. And so within themselves, they were nothing but dead men's bones, even though outwardly they appeared these beautiful sepulchres. Jesus said, unless your righteousness exceeds that, you're not going to enter into the kingdom of heaven. So take the best and the brightest among the religious elite, and Jesus says you have to do better than that. And the only way for you to do that is if you have a strong desire. Romans 10, verses 1 through 3, Paul, in talking about his brethren in the flesh, the children of Israel, says in Romans 10, starting at verse 1, that, brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. For they, being ignorant of God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted to the righteousness of God. The reason that I am not everything that God would have me to be is for one real simple reason. I'm not longing for it. I'm not hungering and thirsting for it. It's something that I would like to have, but I look at it as being a snack and not as life-sustaining, because I'm starving to death without it. It's also because sometimes it gets spoon-fed to us. That there's somebody who has to teach it to my kids in Bible class because they're not going to hear it at home. Well, the only time that me and my wife are going to hear it is when we show up for services. But we're not going to take the time to sit down and study ourselves. If we have that idea that it has to be spoon-fed to us, it's a long ways from being where God would have us to be. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. It is indeed a spiritual longing. As Jesus talked about in John 4, when he met this woman, this Samaritan woman at this well, and he asked her for some water. And from that conversation, he was able to elicit some curiosity within her. And they began this conversation about living water. And Jesus said to her in verse 13 that whoever drinks of this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water springing up into everlasting life. And so Jesus uses that statement to arouse her curiosity. This woman who is there at the well and Jesus has this conversation with her, he doesn't walk straight into a conversation about her being a Samaritan and him being a Jew and how the Samaritans worship this way, but the Jews worship this way, and that you Samaritans are wrong in the ways that you worship, we Jews are correct in the ways we worship. He gets there. But the way that he gets there is this. He creates some curiosity in her. Give me something to drink. Well, the Jews only apparently are asking for something when they talking to us when they want something. You know, there's water that I can give you that if you drink from that, you will never be thirsty again. And to a woman that's always having to come to the well to get her water and to take it back home, however long that walk was, that would be something that would be pretty astounding. Well, give me this water. And from there, Jesus says, if you knew who it was who was saying this to you, if you only knew. And so she began to understand that spiritual application that was there. And you remember at the end of this story, his disciples who have already been in Samaria to get food, they come back and there's nobody coming back with them to listen to Jesus. But this one woman who had had several husbands goes back into the city and talks about Jesus and the conversation they had and the things that Jesus did. And she brings back, it sounds like, the whole city with her. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Jesus was one that had a conversation with this woman. It seems that he didn't go into the city, the disciples felt like, because he was so hungry, he just was going to stay there and wait for the food to come back. But when they come back, they want him to eat, and he says, I have food with which to eat that you have no idea of what I'm even speaking of. And they begin to think, has somebody given him something to eat? Because he seems to be very pepped up now about something. Did somebody give him something to eat? No, blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for even the Son of God himself was filled when he received it. You ever been in that situation where it's like, I don't know if I really feel like going to services. I don't really feel like going to Wednesday night. I've had a hard week. I've had a hard day at work. My boss was on me. I got all these deadlines. I got all these horrible things going on, and I just don't know if I feel like going. But then you go instead. And when you go and you hear a great lesson, no doubt. But when you hear that, it does maybe spark something in you. Say, you know what, maybe we should do some things about that. Maybe we should make some changes. Maybe we ought to be thinking about that. And then the brethren start shaking your hand, or in our day and time, waving at each other and having good conversations. And by the end of the night, you're not only glad that you came, but it takes a long time for you to leave. That's what we're talking about. You had a hunger and you had a thirst, and you know the real place to satisfy that? It's among God's people. You're not going to find that somewhere else. And Jesus never promised it somewhere else. But he does say that when we hunger and thirst after it, here we are going to be filled. Even in chapter 6, as he has to chastise these people that are following him only for this physical bread that they had received the day before. In verse 32, he says, most assuredly I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Then they said to him, Lord, give us this bread always. And Jesus said to him, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. And so later in John 6, when he talks about his flesh being bread and his blood being drink, he's not talking about the Lord's Supper. He's talking about the words of life, and he's talking about who he is as the one come down from heaven. And that if we partake of him, of who he is, we will never thirst. We will never hunger again. That kind of fulfillment is not offered to us anywhere else. And it is unblessed hungering and thirsting to seek for it somewhere else. You remember that earlier we talked about Jehovah Zidkenu. And if you remember that word Jehovah Zidkenu, it means the Lord our righteousness. The Lord is our righteousness. And that last word that's used in the name of God, Zidkenu, for righteousness, it means stiff. It means strict. It means unwavering. God, who is the righteous one, because he is stiff, he is strict, he is unwavering. He does not change. His ways are perfect, and he never deviates from them. He is our righteousness. And so in Philippians chapter 3, when Paul talks about Jesus Christ, notice the longing and the desire that Paul had for Jesus, who is indeed our righteousness. Philippians chapter 3, verses 8 and 9, Paul says, "And to be found in him," speaking of Jesus, "and be found in Jesus, not having my own righteousness which is from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ, the righteousness which is from God by faith, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death." Over and over again, Paul talks about the way in which he desired Christ. And right before this, he said that all the things that were counted gain to him, you remember what he considered them? Rubbish, trash, filth, nothing to be held on to. And said that he gladly lets go of all of it just for the purpose of knowing Jesus Christ and his righteousness. That's what hunger and thirst is. Hunger and thirst is the image of Saul of Tarsus, when he is struck blind on the road and has to be led by the hand into the city. And when he receives the words by which he can be saved, he immediately responds to it and gets to work. And he leaves behind everything, because Paul was one who was hungering and thirsting after what was right. And when he found what was right, he was going to pay any price for it. That's what we're called to do. That's what Jesus is talking about. And that's the blessedness that comes. Because, as it says, they shall be filled. Another name that we talked about when we talked about the names of God was El Shaddai. And if you remember that word Shaddai at the end of that, it meant Almighty or all-sufficient God. Also, the way in which that word is sometimes used in the Scriptures is to talk about a mother's breasts and the life-giving that is given there. And it's talking about the mothers being all-sufficient and all-giving. That child is completely dependent upon the mother for the giving of the life and the sustaining of the life. And that's when we talk about God being the Almighty and the all-sufficient. He is the one who gives life. He is the one who sustains life. He is the Almighty. He is the Great One. And so when we are seeking with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, God is going to give the fulfillment of what it is that we're looking for, that salvation and that righteousness especially. 1 Peter chapter 2 does compare it to a child when it says, "Therefore lay aside all malice, all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and evil speaking. As newborn babes, desire the pure milk of the word, that you may grow thereby, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is gracious." In other words, you know what it tastes like. And you remember what it was like when you first obeyed the gospel? When you came up from the waters of baptism? Did anyone have to beg you to read the Bible in those moments after you obeyed the gospel? Did anyone have to invite you to attend worship services after you obeyed the gospel? Or is that something that you were looking forward to each and every time? You know, there's something that changes over time. We forget. And as it says here, if you've tasted that the Lord is gracious, remember what that was like. And put away all those other things and be like that newborn babe again. That you have that kind of desire. A child is not going to worry about whether you want sleep in the middle of the night. A child does not care if you're in the middle of a worship assembly. A child does not care. A child wants to be fed. And it's going to let you and everyone else around you know it right now. And I'm not waiting any longer. And brethren, that's the way we're supposed to be when it comes to righteousness. I don't care what's going on in the world. I don't care how much turmoil there is. I don't care who it bothers by me saying it. I want to be righteous. I want to be godly. I want to know my God and see him face to face. And that can bother a lot of people. But I quite frankly don't care if I have that childlike demeanor about me. I'm not going to apologize to somebody because I want to be godly. I'm not going to apologize to somebody. I'm not going to put it on the back burner for my wife, my kids, my friends, my job, I don't care. I want to be righteous, and I want to be righteous now. That's what it means to have that childlike hunger and thirst for righteousness. And I'm going to fight, scream, and yell until I get it. Is that the attitude that I still have? When I first obeyed the gospel, that's the way it was. And because of that, there were a lot of people that you sometimes put off because you'll say things and you're very immature. But with maturity sometimes comes a loss of that appetite. And that's devastating. And we need that once again. And so maybe going back to a place like the first few verses of the Psalms and understanding that Psalm 1 is sort of like the Beatitudes that we've read so far. You remember, blessed are those. That's how the Beatitudes talk about. The poor in spirit, the mourn, the meek, those who mourn and the meek, those who have emptied themselves. Notice this, blessed is the man who's emptied himself. He doesn't walk in the counsel of the ungodly. He doesn't stand in the path of sinners. He doesn't sit with the scornful. But what is he filled with? What is he hungering and thirsting after? His delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. He shall be filled. He shall be like a tree that's planted by the rivers of water, that brings forth its fruit in its season, whose leaf also shall not wither, and whatever he does shall prosper. Just like the Beatitudes we've read so far, here's the blessed man of Psalm 1. And it's the same thing. God's principles have always been there. If we empty ourselves of the world and fill ourselves with righteousness, we will be blessed, as God has promised. And so that's the question I'm going to leave with you tonight is, what is it that you're truly longing for more than anything else? If you're longing to be righteous, if you're longing for the things that God offers, He's not withholding them from any who's desirous of them. If you hunger and thirst for this, if you are so pain-stricken by the hunger for this, God is ready to fill. But you have to desire it. If there's something that we can help you with this night, if there's something you need to repent of, if there's something that you need to grow, let us know. That's what we're here for. As together we stand and sing, won't you please come if we can help.